When you're learning your DSLR, or even a film SLR, one of the first things you'll begin to understand is how exposure is controlled. With this digital SLR, I can change ISO, aperture, and shutter speed from shot to shot. Now, I like to keep my shooting pretty simple, so I am most often controlling aperture and letting my camera control the other two. Here in the studio, I like to set my ISO on the base setting, which on my D300S here is ISO 200. I also like to set aperture manually. More on that in a minute though. Since I have set the two variables, I will let the camera control the shutter speed so that I can get the correct exposure. One thing I can do with continuous lights that I can't with studio strobes is have the camera use the shutter speed to control the exposure. Strobes have two disadvantages. One, your camera cannot meter quickly enough to calculate and set exposure for the instant burst of light that comes from the strobes. So exposure must be set manually. Cameras today have all sorts of high-tech metering capabilities, but when you're using strobes, you can't take advantage of what you paid for. And two, since the burst from the strobes is 1/8,000th of a second or faster, the shutter speed that you use with them has no impact on the exposure here in the dark studio. This means that I have one less variable to control exposure with. To get the right exposure, I either need to make aperture adjustments on the camera, or if I'm working with wider apertures, I have to considerably lower the power output of the strobes, which gives me diminished creative control of the lighting. It can all sound complicated, but fundamentally, every time I want to change camera aperture when using strobes, I also have to make adjustments to the power output of the strobes. That's a lot to adjust from shot to shot. Okay, now before I talk about continuous lights and their advantages over strobes, let's talk about aperture and why I like to control it without having to adjust everything else. Aperture controls how much of your scene is in focus. The term here is depth of field. With a wide aperture, that's a lower f-stop on your camera, less of your image will be in focus from front to back. This is great for portrait photography, or anytime that you want to isolate an object from the background, or even the foreground.
Okay, so I've got my model here, Sandra. Love her. I am going to be dealing with some depth of field today. What we want is Sandra has a pumpkin, and she's going to be the lovely model holding the pumpkin that is kind of the product. And you know, the product could be anything, but you know how a lot of times you'll see a model holding something out and that item is in, you know, super clear, crisp, you know, beautiful color, and then the model that's actually holding the pumpkin is a little bit blurred out in the background because, you know, she's almost there just to complement the pumpkin in this case. So what I'm going to do to achieve that shallow depth of field is I've got my camera set on aperture priority because I'm using the continuous lights. So I'm going to let it choose the shutter speed after I set the aperture. I've got the aperture on f1.8 and we're going to see how it goes. So go ahead and hold that pumpkin right out and give me a smile. Very nice. You're selling that pumpkin beautifully.
Remember that you can use the same technique to blur the background. In those photos, I would have focused on Sandra instead of on the pumpkin. So Sandra would have been in focus and the background would have been blurred, and probably the pumpkin too. With a narrow aperture, I can get more things in focus. This is great for landscape shots, groups of people scattered about, or when I want to include background detail in a portrait. I'm going to use these pumpkins here to illustrate a deep depth of field. If I were to take a photo of this and want kind of all of it in focus, I could use you know, f8 or even f11 to get my foreground and my background in focus. For me, aperture is the most important thing to control when I'm working with lighting. Now, I talked about the limitations of controlling aperture when using strobes. So let's talk about the advantages you have when working with continuous lighting, like the Linco Flora kit that I have. As you could see in the video with Sandra, these lights are producing a steady amount of lighting rather than an instantaneous burst. When I point my camera at the model, it's metering. the fancy computer in my camera is able to go to work and evaluate the lighting in the scene. And I may tweak the exposure a bit depending on what I'm going for, but the camera itself gives me a great starting point. I like shooting portraits at f2.8 and f4. With the continuous lights, I can set the camera in aperture priority, move around the model, and just keep shooting. Because the lighting is continuous, the camera can continually monitor the scene and make shutter speed adjustments, and it'll ensure that my image is not over or underexposed. And this is just impossible with strobes without having to make other manual adjustments. One other thing that I like in particular about my fluorescent lights is that they are fluorescent. One of the traditional complaints about continuous lighting is that they produce a tremendous amount of heat. Not anymore. These lights do not get hot. They just get a little bit warm. And unlike strobes, the model does not have to deal with flash bursts constantly going off in her face. So, let's recap. With continuous lights, I can set aperture manually while taking advantage of the metering system in the camera. Shutter speed adjustments can be used to control exposure. I can see right in front of me what my shot is going to look like. And the model doesn't need to sit in front of lights that heat up to hundreds of degrees. I talked a lot today, and I went pretty quickly through some pretty advanced topics. So if you have any questions at all, please let me know.
Thanks for watching Linco TV. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Linco would like to offer you the use of their studios with all of your lighting equipment needs for all aspiring photographers and models, free of charge. They are located in Santa Fe Springs, California. And for more details, feel free to email them below at the address. See you soon.